Number 10. The Golden Masts of Klaus Störtebeker. There is a class of treasure story that historians hate and folklore refuses to let go of. This is the purest example of it. Klaus Störtebeker, born around 1360 in the Baltic town of Wismar, was not a Caribbean pirate. He belonged to a band called the Vitalienbrüder, the Victual Brothers, later renamed the Lyckadealers, or Equal Sharers, because they split their plunder among themselves like a working commune with cutlasses. The Victual Brothers were originally hired by the Mecklenburg dukes to run supplies through the Danish blockade to besieged Stockholm during a war between Denmark and Sweden. When that war ended and their contract ran out, they did what many mercenaries do. They kept the ships and pointed them at the nearest merchant vessel. For nearly a decade, Störtebeker and captains like Goedeke Michels, Hennig Wichman, and Magister Wigbold hunted the trade routes of the Hanseatic League, robbing Hamburg cogs of wax, salt, potash, cloth, and coin. Their battle cry was a matter of public record: God's friends and the whole world's enemies. In 1401, a Hamburg fleet cornered him near the North Sea island of Heligoland. Störtebeker was taken alive with 72 of his companions and dragged back to Hamburg in chains. On the Graubrook, the tidal marsh outside the harbor entrance, they were all beheaded. The legend of the beheading itself is the one everybody remembers. Störtebeker supposedly asked the mayor to spare as many of his men as his own headless body could walk past. The mayor agreed, believing it impossible. When the axe came down, his body reportedly stood up and walked past 11 of them before the executioner tripped him. The mayor then reneged and had all 73 executed anyway. Whether or not any of that happened, it is not what puts Störtebeker on this list. This is what puts him on this list. Hamburg impounded his ships. When they could find nothing in his cabins, no chests, no strong boxes, no hidden compartments, they sold his flagship to a shipwright for scrap. As the shipwright dismantled the vessel, his saw hit metal inside the masts. According to Hamburg tradition, the masts had been hollowed out and filled with poured cores, one filled with pure gold, one filled with silver, one filled with copper. The shipwright is said to have melted down enough gold to gild the crown of the new spire on St. Catherine's Church in Hamburg, a landmark that stood for centuries afterward. Now, no modern historian believes the masts really contain solid metal cores. Structurally, it is nonsense. The weight would have rolled the ship. But Hamburg preserved the story with a straight face for 600 years, and the reason it survives is that it fits a real problem in the record. Störtebeker was one of the most successful pirates the Baltic ever produced. When Hamburg finally caught him, the treasury was mysteriously light. The men had been raiding merchant convoys for a decade. Where did all the loot go? Nobody has ever been able to answer that question. Störtebeker's skull, or a skull that Hamburg has attributed to him, since 1878 sits in the city's history museum, in a glass case. It was stolen once in 2010 by a thief who dressed as a workman and vanished with it into Hafen City before being recovered by police in 2011. That is the closest anybody has come to holding a piece of Störtebeker's fortune. Everything else, the gold masts, the buried Baltic caches attributed to the Lyckadealers, the network of Frisian coves they used as hiding places, remain in the FYI column of German folklore. A pirate whose treasure supposedly financed a church steeple. A ship that supposedly weighed more than physics allows. And a skull in a glass box, minus a body, minus the fortune the body was supposedly hiding. Number 9. The 1715 Spanish Plate Fleet. This one is different from every other entry on this list, not because we do not know where the treasure is. We know exactly where the treasure is. It is because we have been pulling it out of the sand for 60 years, and there is still, provably, more of it left. On July 24th, 1715, 11 heavily laden Spanish ships and one French frigate weighed anchor in Havana Harbor. They were bound for Spain. In their holds sat one of the largest single shipments of New World treasure ever assembled. Silver from the mines of Peru and Bolivia, gold from Mexico, pearls, emeralds, Chinese porcelain shipped from the Manila galleons across the isthmus, and coins minted by the millions. Estimates of the total cargo have ranged from 6 million to over 14 million pieces of 8, depending on which manifest you trust. Spain desperately needed this shipment. The recent War of the Spanish Succession had drained the royal treasury. King Philip V had personally ordered the fleet held together for maximum security. 7 days later, on the night of July 30th, into the morning of July 31st, a hurricane caught the fleet as it hugged the Florida coast north of what is now Cape Canaveral. All 11 Spanish ships went down. The French frigate Le Griffon, whose captain had refused to hug the shoreline and had stayed further out to sea, sailed on to Europe unharmed. Cuban records put the death toll at around 1,500 sailors. Bodies washed up for weeks. The Spanish moved quickly. They established a salvage camp on the beach and began sending divers down to strip the wrecks. Then, a British privateer named Henry Jennings sailed in from Jamaica with 3 ships and around 300 men, overwhelmed the Spanish guards, and took roughly 87,000 pieces of 8 in a single raid. Jennings, now officially a wanted pirate, fled to a lightly governed harbor in the Bahamas called Nassau. Other Englishmen, hearing about the wrecks and about Jennings, followed. Within 2 years, that harbor was the Republic of Pirates, home to Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Benjamin Hornigold, Sam Bellamy, Anne Bonny, Calico Jack, and hundreds more. The 1715 sinking did not just lose Spain a fortune, it literally created the Pirate Republic at Nassau. That is why this entry belongs on the list. The Spanish salvors of the 1710s recovered some of the cargo, but they could not get it all. The Atlantic buried the rest. In the 1950s, a Florida beachcomber named Kip Wagner started noticing strange flat black rocks on his morning walks. When he polished one, it turned out to be a Spanish silver real. He and a small team of divers tracked the wrecks and over the next decade pulled up more than $1 million worth of coins, gold, discs, and jewelry. Salvage rights eventually passed to a company called 1715 Fleet Queen's Jewels, LLC, and every summer since then, they have been finding more. In 2015, on the 300th anniversary of the sinking, divers pulled up 350 gold coins worth around $4.5 million from the Corrigan's wreck. In the 2025 summer salvage season, another crew off the Treasure Coast recovered more than 1,000 silver reels plus gold chain fragments and a gemstone, together worth roughly $1 million, believed to have come from a single spilled chest. The Florida beaches between Vero Beach and Sebastian are still nicknamed the Treasure Coast for a reason. Coins wash up after storms. Kids find them. Beachcombers with metal detectors find them. The salvers estimate that the total original cargo may have been worth around $400 million in modern terms, and only a fraction of it has ever been recovered. Somewhere out there under the sand, the rest is waiting. The pirates who plundered the salvers are dead. The salvers who plundered the pirates are dead. The wrecks themselves keep giving. Number 8, the chest of Amaro Pargo. Most pirates on this list left the world guessing where their treasure was. Amaro Pargo did something stranger. He left the world a legal document listing exactly what was in his treasure and where he had put it, and 3 centuries later, we still cannot find it. Amaro Rodriguez Felipe, better known by his fish-based nickname Amaro Pargo, was born in San Cristobal de la Laguna on Tenerife in 1678. Pargo is the Spanish name for a species of porgy, a marauding fish that hunts smaller prey, and the nickname suited him. He was not, in the strict Caribbean sense, a pirate. He was a corsair, meaning he sailed with a letter of marque from King Philip V of Spain that authorized him to attack the enemies of the crown. In practice, that meant English and Dutch shipping on the Cadiz to Caribbean route. In practice, that also meant he did the exact same job as an English pirate, but with paperwork, and he was extraordinarily good at it. His fleet, which at its height included the frigate Ave Maria y las Animas, the ship Nuestra Senora de los Remedios, and a vessel nicknamed El Gavilan, the Hawk, ran the Havana route for years. He also became a legitimate trader shipping wine, silks, and other exotic goods across the Atlantic. He grew rich enough to fund charitable donations, sponsor a saint shrine, and be granted a title of nobility. Felipe V personally called him a lord of rope and knife. When he died in 1747, he was buried in the church of Santo Domingo in La Laguna under a tombstone engraved with a skull and crossbones and, oddly, a winking eye. The wink was not vanity. It was Amaro's last joke to the world. Because in his own written will filed with the Spanish authorities, he described a specific chest. This chest, he wrote, contained silver, gold, jewels, pearls, precious stones, Chinese porcelain, and paintings. The itemized inventory of everything inside the chest was written down in a separate book wrapped in parchment and marked with the letter D. He specified that the chest was kept in his cabin. And then he died, and neither the chest nor the book has ever been located. That last word is the entire problem. Cabin. In Spanish, the word he used can mean a room, a cabin aboard ship, or a small country cabin on an estate. His main house in Machado, in the town of El Rosario on Tenerife, has been searched by professional treasure hunters and by ordinary looters so many times that the ruins are barely stable. Nothing. His frequently used hideout, a sea cave called the Cave of San Mateo at Punta del Hidalgo on the northeast coast of Tenerife, has been combed by generations of amateurs. Nothing. Some researchers believe the word cabin in the 18th century usage of a wealthy Canary Islander may mean a small summer cottage or hunting cabin on land he owned, which would explain why it has never been found. Any such structure would have collapsed and rotted into dirt by now. If the chest is real, it may be sitting under the vanished floorboards of a building that ceased to exist 200 years ago. In 2016, Josh Gates and the American treasure hunter Bradley Williamson filmed an episode of Expedition Unknown on Tenerife, specifically about Amaro's chest. They came away with a lot of atmosphere and no chest. Today, if you visit San Cristobal de la Laguna, there is a gamified walking tour called the Treasure of Amaro Pargo that lets tourists play at solving the mystery for an afternoon. The real one is Unsolved, a will, an inventory, a church tomb with a winking skull, and somewhere, if the paperwork is honest, a wooden chest full of a lifetime's plunder that has outlasted its owner by 3 centuries. Number 7. The Lost Fortune of Henry Every. If you want to know why 8-year-olds still draw pirates with cutlasses and eye patches, the answer is a man named Henry Every. Not Blackbeard, not Captain Kidd. Henry Every, sometimes written Avery or Every, sometimes calling himself Benjamin Bridgman or Long Ben. In 1695, he pulled off the single most lucrative act of piracy in recorded history. Then he sailed home and vanished so completely that not even the East India Company, backed by the personal fury of the Mughal emperor, could find him. Every was born around 1653 near Plymouth in Devon. He had served in the Royal Navy and by the early 1690s was working as a slave ship first mate on an expedition anchored at La Coruña in Spain. When the pay ran months late and the crew grew mutinous, Every led them in seizing the ship, renaming her the Fancy, and turning pirate. The Fancy sailed for the Indian Ocean. There, in the Red Sea, Every joined forces with several other pirate captains, including Thomas Tew, and together they set an ambush for the annual Mughal treasure convoy returning from Mecca. On the night of September 6th into 7th, 1695, they spotted a convoy of around 25 Mughal ships. The first prize they caught was the Fateh Muhammad. That ship alone gave them around 50,000 pounds sterling in gold and silver. Then Every's fleet caught up with the real target, the Ganji Sawai, whose name translated roughly as exceeding treasure. She was one of the richest ships owned by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb personally. She was armed with around 80 cannons and carried 1,100 crew and passengers, including pilgrims returning from the Hajj. She should have destroyed the Fancy in a straight fight. She did not. One of her cannons burst on the first exchange of fire, killing gunners and wrecking morale. Her captain lost his nerve and hid below decks. After a running battle of several hours, Every's men boarded her. What followed was a horror. The pirates spent several days on board, torturing prisoners for information, sexually assaulting the women, throwing the men overboard, and stripping the ship of every valuable item. Total plunder from the two Mughal ships, in modern terms, has been estimated at anywhere between $95 million and over $100 million. When word reached Emperor Aurangzeb, he ordered the closure of every English trading port in his empire and demanded that the East India Company deliver every for execution. King William III of England issued the first worldwide manhunt in history for every, dead or alive, and Henry Every simply vanished. He sailed the Fancy back across the Indian Ocean, past the Cape of Good Hope, and up to the pirate haven of New Providence in the Bahamas, where he bribed the governor with the Fancy herself and a stash of ivory and gunpowder. He then split his crew, took a small share of the treasure, and boarded a sloop called the Isaac, bound for Ireland. He was seen landing in Ireland in June 1696. That November, 6 of his crew members who had been careless enough to spread their coins around English pubs were arrested, tried, and hanged in London. Not for the Mughal raid specifically, since the East India Company was still trying to smooth things over with Aurangzeb, but for piracy. Every himself, the leader, the one everyone actually wanted, was never seen again. The rumors began immediately and have never stopped. Some accounts said he moved to Scotland under a false name. Others said he was cheated out of his fortune by Bristol merchants who bought his diamonds at a fraction of their worth and turned him in for the reward. According to that story, Every died penniless in the West Country, unable to prove his identity without incriminating himself. Others said he settled quietly in Devon or the West Indies with his diamonds and lived to old age. What is verifiable is this. The single biggest pirate hull of the golden age of piracy left the deck of the Ganges Sawai in 1695. Most of the crew, having buried or spent their shares, disappear from the record within a decade. Every himself disappeared entirely. Not one confirmed piece of the treasure has ever been publicly identified. Somewhere in the fields of southern Ireland, or the West Country of England, or the Caribbean, or the bottom of a river between them is the greatest lost pirate hoard in history. Number 6. Blackbeard's fortune. Every man on this list knew his loot would outlive him. Only one of them turned that fact into a joke on his deathbed. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, was probably born in Bristol around 1680. His career as a pirate was short and loud. He served under Benjamin Hornigold, then took his own command, captured a French slave ship called La Concorde in 1717, and renamed her the Queen Anne's Revenge. For roughly a year and a half, that 40-gun frigate was the most feared ship in the Atlantic. Blackbeard's technique was theater. Before boarding, he would tie slow-burning fuses into his enormous black beard, light them, and appear in the boarding party wrapped in smoke, looking like the devil incarnate. Ships surrendered without firing a shot. In May 1718, he blockaded the harbor of Charlestown, South Carolina, capturing several vessels and holding wealthy passengers for ransom until the town paid him in medicine. Then, in June 1718, he ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground at Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina, possibly on purpose to shrink his own crew and take a larger share of the loot for himself and a few favorites. He accepted a royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina and set up quietly at Ocracoke Island. It was a ruse. Within months, he was raiding shipping again. In November 1718, the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy with 2 sloops to end him. On the night of November 21st, 1718, Blackbeard's ship, the Adventure, set anchored at Ocracoke, and Blackbeard's men, having no idea Maynard was 3 miles away at Beacon Island preparing to attack, at dawn spent the night drinking. And here, according to Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 book, A General History of the Pyrites, one of his men asked him a question: "If anything should happen in the fight tomorrow, does your wife know where you buried your money?" Blackbeard's answer, in Johnson's exact words, was that nobody but himself and the devil knew where it was, and the longest liver should take it all. The next day, Maynard's men attacked. Blackbeard was killed in a boarding action after taking 5 gunshot wounds, and around 20 sword cuts. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as it sailed back to Virginia. The problem, and the reason Blackbeard's fortune is on this list, is what the Royal Navy did next. They searched the Adventure, top to bottom, they tore apart his cabin, they interrogated the surviving crew, they found sugar, cocoa, some coin, and a set of journals. They did not find anything remotely like the pile of gold and silver a pirate of his reputation should have accumulated. Blackbeard had operated for less than 2 years, but during that time he had taken more than 40 ships. Where was it all? The problem for treasure hunters is that we know exactly where he operated, and it is still not enough. Modern historians now argue that Blackbeard was probably not the buried Hoard type. He seems to have spent freely and paid his crew generously. Some researchers, like the historian Kevin Duffus, have argued that the real story of Blackbeard's economic footprint is not about jewels, but about the boom his ships brought to the North Carolina port of Bath, where he seems to have laundered his profits through legitimate commerce and enslaved labor. But the legend refuses to die, and the North Carolina coast is dotted with candidate sites. Ocracoke Island itself, Plum Point on the Pamlico River, Cayman Brac, even the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge herself, which was discovered by divers in 1996 and has since yielded thousands of artifacts including cannons, medical instruments, and a small amount of gold dust, but nothing resembling a chest of coin. If Blackbeard really did bury a hoard, the location died with him at Ocracoke. All we have is his last joke to his men, recorded in a book written 6 years after his death by an author whose real identity historians are still arguing about. Nobody but himself and the devil. And the devil so far is not talking. Number 5. Jean Lafitte and the Gulf Caches. Every entry on this list so far has been about one lost treasure. This entry is about dozens of them. Jean Lafitte was born in France around 1780 by the early 1800s. He and his brother Pierre were running a smuggling and privateering operation out of Barataria Bay south of New Orleans, a maze of marshes and inlets where no government revenue officer could operate effectively. After the American Embargo Act of 1807 shut down legitimate imports, the Lafittes became the alternative economy of the Gulf Coast. They fenced captured cargo through a warehouse in New Orleans. They ran auctions for smuggled goods and, deplorably, for enslaved human beings. They commanded a private navy of privateers who fought under whatever flag was convenient that month. In 1814, when the British approached New Orleans in the final months of the War of 1812, Jean Lafitte turned down a bribe from the Royal Navy and instead offered his services and his men to General Andrew Jackson. The Baratarians manned artillery at the Battle of New Orleans and were pardoned for their previous smuggling crimes as a reward. Then, in 1817, Lafitte and his brother re-established themselves at Galveston Island on the coast of Spanish Texas. They called their new base Campeche, and for about 4 years they ran the same Gulf privateering operation from there. By 1821, the United States Navy had had enough. The USS Enterprise sailed into Galveston Bay and told Lafitte he had to leave. He left without a fight, earning most of the settlement behind him. And here is where the treasure story starts. Because when Lafitte left Galveston, witnesses insisted that he had buried a large quantity of gold, silver, and gems along the coast rather than try to carry it all aboard his ships. The problem was that everyone claimed to know where, and they all disagreed. Over the last 200 years, credible-sounding Lafitte cache stories have been attached to almost every inlet and river mouth between the Sabine River and Mobile Bay. On the Texas side, they include Galveston Island itself, the Bolivar Peninsula, Sabine Pass, the mouth of the Trinity River near modern Baytown, LaPorte, and various sites along the San Bernard and Brazos rivers. LaPorte, Texas still holds an annual event called the Search for Lafitte's Gold. In Louisiana, the legends, attached to the town of Lafitte itself, to Jefferson Island, to Lake Salvador, to the Amite River across from the ruins of Galvestown, to a shell bank on Lake Misere, north of Cheniere Ridge, to the Mermentau and Calcasieu rivers near Contraband Bayou, and to the campus of a former Catholic school in New Orleans, based on a former student who insisted a specific oak tree stood over a Lafitte chest. In 1923, 3 treasure chests were dug up on Jefferson Island containing French, English, and Spanish gold and silver coins minted in the 1700s. A knife typically used by Caribbean pirates was found nearby. That find is often attributed to Lafitte, though it could have belonged to any number of Gulf smugglers who used the same coves. It remains the only major cache from that period ever recovered in Louisiana. Every other Lafitte site remains unverified. There are 24 documented candidate sites in Louisiana alone. Modern treasure hunters still walk them with metal detectors. The state of Texas designates a stretch of coast around Galveston as officially Lafitte territory for the purposes of tourism marketing. Jean Lafitte's own end is another one of history's shrubs. He probably died around 1823, either in a naval battle off Honduras or of yellow fever in the Yucatan, depending on which source you trust. His last confirmed sighting was in Cuba. If he really did bury the accumulated wealth of a decade of Gulf privateering, he did it in dozens of small holes across 800 miles of coastline. And whichever ones nobody has dug up yet are still down there, sinking a few more centimeters into swamp mud every year. Number 4. The Treasure of Bonito. There is a small volcanic island 340 miles off the coast of Costa Rica called Isla del Coco. It is 9 square miles of rainforest, granite cliffs, and waterfalls. Robert Louis Stevenson used it as his inspiration for Treasure Island. Michael Crichton used it as the model for Isla Nublar in Jurassic Park. Costa Rica has designated it a national park and a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1994. Treasure hunting on the island has been officially banned. This has not stopped anyone, because according to accepted history, at least 3 major treasure caches were buried on Coco's Island during the 19th century, and the largest and best documented of the earlier ones belonged to a pirate called Benito. Bonito is a name shrouded in confusion. Some accounts say he was Portuguese. Some say he was a former British Royal Navy officer named Captain Bennet Graham who had served under Nelson. Others say Benito and Graham were the same man operating under an alias. What is broadly agreed is that around 1818 he was operating in the Pacific in a fast brig called the Relampago, or Lightning, and that his signature raid was on a Spanish mule train transporting gold from mines in the Mexican Cordillera down to Acapulco. According to 19th century treasure hunting testimony, his men ambushed the guards dressed in the guards' uniforms, walked the mule train right up to a waiting Spanish galleon whose crew mistook them for the legitimate escort, and captured the ship with almost no resistance. From there, Benito ran a career burning and looting Spanish galleons along the Pacific coast of Mexico and Central America. Contemporary accounts, most of them collected decades later, estimate his total plunder at over 350 tons of gold, plus silver, jewels, and ceremonial swords. He needed somewhere to hide it, and he found Coco's. Coco's was perfect, uninhabited, difficult to approach in bad weather, fresh water available from the waterfall at Wafer Bay, and thousands of miles from any Spanish naval patrol. Benito is said to have buried the bulk of his plunder in a deep tunnel or cave complex somewhere in the vicinity of Wafer Bay, sometime between 1818 and 1821. The specific inventory attributed to his cache, again from later treasure hunting testimony, is astonishing. 300,000 pounds of silver ingots, 733 gold bricks, each roughly 4 inches by 3 inches by 2 inches thick, 273 swords with gold hilts, chests of loose jewels, and coin. In modern estimates, the Bonito cache alone would be worth somewhere around $300 million and possibly much more. His end matches the legend of his career. Cornered somewhere off the coast by a British frigate, so the story goes, Benito realized escape was impossible and shot himself in the head rather than be taken. His crew was killed or captured, and one of the surviving crew members, a woman named Mary Welsh, who had sailed with him as a cabin girl or camp follower, depending on which version you read, was transported to a penal colony in Australia. When she was eventually released, decades later she led an expedition back to Cocos, armed with her memory of the burial site's location bearings. Storms had reshaped the shoreline. The landmarks she remembered were gone. she never found the cache. That set the pattern for what came next. A German adventurer named August Gissler became so obsessed with the Bonito cache that in 1897 the Costa Rican government made him the official and only governor of Cocos Island. Gissler brought a small colony of German farmers, dug an extensive system of tunnels, and stayed on the island for 20 years. He found scattered pirate-era coins, but never the main cache. He left the island in 1908. Broke and exhausted, Franklin D. Roosevelt visited Cocos as U.S. president and briefly indulged the treasure story. So did the actor Errol Flynn. So, according to some accounts, did the American gangster Bugsy Siegel. In total, there have been more than 300 recorded treasure expeditions to Cocos Island. None have succeeded. Every single one has come home empty-handed or with a handful of coins whose provenance cannot be confirmed. Bonito, if he existed as described, buried the largest single pirate cache in the Pacific somewhere on a 9-square-mile island. FYI, that island has now been searched more thoroughly than probably anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And still, nothing. Number 3. The Treasure of Lima. If Bonito is a legend cased in real historical circumstance, the Treasure of Lima is a real historical circumstance cased in legend. And it was buried, according to tradition, on the exact same island. In 1820, the army of the Argentine general José de San Martin was closing in on the Spanish colonial capital of Lima. The viceroy of Peru, José de la Serna, saw what was coming. If San Martin took the city the accumulated wealth of the Catholic Church in colonial Peru, more than 200 years of accumulated gold, silver, jewels, and religious artifacts would fall into revolutionary hands. So, de la Serna made a decision that seemed at the time prudent. He decided to move it somewhere safer, somewhere reachable by ship. And to do it quietly, before the citizens of Lima realized the church was pulling its wealth out of the country, he needed a captain and a vessel to hold the treasure temporarily at anchor off Callao Harbor until the political situation resolved. The captain he chose was an Englishman named William Thompson, who commanded a merchant brig called the Mary Dear. Thompson had a reputation for reliability. He was a foreigner, meaning he had no political stake in the revolution. And his ship was fast. What the viceroy did not know, or did not consider carefully enough, was what would happen when Thompson opened the crates. The inventory, according to accounts pieced together later, was staggering. A life-size statue of the Virgin Mary cast in solid gold and studded with gems weighing around 780 pounds, 272 jeweled ceremonial swords, hundreds of gold plates and chalices set with jewels, chests of loose gemstones, bars of gold and silver bullion, and enough gold and silver coin to fill several rooms. Modern estimates place the total value in modern currency at anywhere from $200 million to over $1 billion. Spanish soldiers and priests came aboard the Mary Dear to guard the shipment. Thompson was under strict instructions to remain at anchor in the harbor until further orders. Instead, the moment the fleet was far enough offshore for it to matter, Thompson and his crew murdered the Spanish guards, and the priests threw their bodies overboard and changed course. Their new destination was Cocos Island. There, in Wafer Bay or Chatham Bay, depending on which account you follow, Thompson and his men buried the entire cargo in a spot they marked with careful bearings, then sailed away, planning to return once the political situation cooled. They never made it back. A Spanish warship caught up with the Mary Dear off the Pacific coast. Thompson's entire crew was hanged as pirates. Only Thompson himself and his first mate, sometimes named as James Alexander Forbes, were spared. Under threat of execution, they agreed to lead the Spanish back to Cocos and reveal the burial site. They did. Once ashore on the island, Thompson and his mate disappeared into the jungle. The Spanish searched for weeks and never found them. Some accounts say the two men survived on fish, coconuts, and birds' eggs for months before being picked up by a passing British whaler. Some say they died on the island. Thompson himself is said to have died shortly afterward, taking the exact burial coordinates to his grave. Forbes, in some tellings, later prepared a detailed map that made its way into private hands and became the seed of every subsequent treasure hunt. Since then, More than 300 expeditions to Cocos Island have looked for the Treasure of Lima alongside the Bonito cache. August Gisler spent 20 years hunting for both. Errol Flynn tried. Roosevelt was briefed on it. A British aviator named Malcolm Campbell led an expedition in the 1920s. Nothing has ever been confirmed. In 2014, an art project called Treasure of Lima, a buried exhibition, buried a vacuum-sealed container of works by 40 different artists somewhere on Cocos as a modern echo of the original burial. That container, at least, is documented. The 780-pound gold virgin, the swords, the plates, and the coin are still, if the traditional story is anything close to accurate, buried somewhere on a small volcanic island west of Costa Rica. And Costa Rica has made it illegal to dig for them. Number 2. Captain Kidd's missing hoard. Everybody thinks they know the story of Captain Kidd. Not many people know that a real part of his treasure was found, weighed, catalogued, and delivered to a court in London to be used as evidence in his own trial for piracy. And that is why the missing part is such a problem. Because the recovered part is proof that the story of Kidd's treasure is not just folklore. William Kidd was born in Dundee, Scotland, around 1645. By the 1690s, he was a respected New York merchant sea captain, married to a wealthy widow, with a house on Wall Street and legitimate business connections up and down the American coast. In 1695, some of the most powerful men in the English government, including the Earl of Bellamont and 4 other Whig lords, hired Kidd as a privateer. His mission was to hunt French shipping and pirates in the Indian Ocean and split the profits with his aristocratic backers. He sailed in a purpose-built ship called the Adventure Galley. The mission went wrong almost from the start. His crew grew mutinous. In one incident, he killed a gunner named William Moore with a bucket. Under pressure from his men, and increasingly desperate, Kidd began attacking ships whose credentials to protect them under French passes were, at best, questionable. In January 1698, he captured his greatest prize, a 400-ton Armenian-owned merchant ship called the Quedagh Merchant, which was carrying silks, muslin, sugar, opium, iron, and other cargo worth an enormous sum. The Quedagh Merchant flew French pass papers, which technically made her a legal prize. But her captain was English, and word reached London that Kidd had crossed the line into piracy. His noble sponsors, terrified of being politically ruined, denounced him. In 1699, Kidd sailed back into the Western Atlantic to try to negotiate his way out of the charge. He knew he was walking into a trap. His treasure could be his bargaining chip, so he began stashing it. One of the stashes went to Gardiner's Island, a small privately owned island at the eastern end of Long Island. He anchored his sloop offshore, invited the owner John Gardner aboard, and made him an offer. Bury this treasure somewhere on your island. Do not tell me where. If I return and it is gone, I will kill you and your family. Gardner did as instructed. His written inventory of what he buried has survived: 2 bags of gold dust, 1 bag of coined gold, 1 parcel of gold dust, 1 bag of silver rings and precious stones, 1 bag of unpolished stones, 1 bag of crystal and bizarre stones, 2 cornelian rings, 3 small agates, and 2 amethysts, 1 bag of silver buttons, and a lamp, 2 bags of gold bars, 2 bags of silver bars. When the Earl of Bellamont arrested Kidd in Boston in July 1699 and inventoried the recovered Gardiner's Island cache, the total came to around 1,111 ounces of gold, 2,549 ounces of silver, a small bag of emeralds weighing 66 ounces, plus jewelry in enameled boxes. Contemporary valuation put the recovered stash at around 20,000 pounds, worth over $1 million in modern terms. That cash was shipped to London and used at Kidd's trial in May 1701. It helped convict him. He was hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping on May 23, 1701. The rope broke on the first attempt. They hanged him a second time, then tarred his body and hung it in a metal cage over the Thames as a warning to other seafarers. And here is where the problem starts. Because Kidd repeatedly insisted, up to his execution, that the Gardiner's Island cache was only part of what he had hidden. He offered to reveal the rest in exchange for his life. The offer was refused, or ignored, or lost in political calculation. His widow petitioned the crown for years afterward to recover his supposed assets. Nothing else was ever officially found. That has never stopped the treasure hunts. Kidd is now the single most attributed name on the buried treasure map of the North American East Coast. Chests have been searched for on Block Island, Rhode Island, on Charles Island in Milford, Connecticut, on Deer Island in Boston Harbor, on multiple sites along the New Jersey shore, including Cape May and the mouth of the Toms River, on Grand Manan Island in New Brunswick, Canada, and most famously on Oak Island in Nova Scotia, whose so-called money pit has consumed lives, fortunes, and one entire television series in the ongoing hunt for Kidd's supposed second cache. Nothing has ever been confirmed. If Kidd's larger fortune existed, it might be buried at any of 20 different sites along a coastline of thousands of miles. Or it might have been quietly recovered by someone in the early 1700s who never told anyone. Or it might never have existed at all, and Kidd may have exaggerated his stash at the trial simply to keep himself alive a few weeks longer. But the Gardiner's Island cache proves the method was real. Somebody's spade could still be waiting on somebody else's beach. Number 1. The Cryptogram of Olivier Levasseur. Every treasure story on this list ends the same way. Somebody dies and the treasure disappears with him. Only one pirate on this list turned the disappearance into a deliberate final act of theater, and into a code that has now defied 300 years of attempts to break it. Olivier Levasseur was born in Calais around 1690 into a moderately wealthy French family. He received a decent education and became a naval officer for Louis XIV. Then, during the War of the Spanish Succession, he sailed as a privateer in the Caribbean under a French letter of marque. When the war ended in 1714 and France stopped needing him, Levasseur, like so many others, refused to go home. He joined the pirates operating out of the Bahamas under Benjamin Hornigold and Samuel Bellamy, then eventually took his own command. His nickname was Le Buse. In French, that means the buzzard, or in some tellings the hawk, a reference to the speed at which he swooped on his prey. He picked up a scar across one eye somewhere along the way. He operated across the Caribbean, and then by 1720, in the Indian Ocean, working alongside British pirate John Taylor. On April 8, 1721, Levasseur, Taylor, and a third captain named Jasper Seagar sailed 2 ships, the Victory and the Cassandra, into the harbor of St. Denis on the island of Réunion, then called Bourbon. Anchored in the harbor was a Portuguese ship, the Nossa Senhora do Cabo, dismasted by a storm and sitting effectively defenseless. On board was the Portuguese Viceroy of Goa. Returning home, also on board was the Archbishop of Goa. And most importantly, on board was the accumulated diplomatic and religious wealth of one of the richest colonial outposts in the Portuguese Empire: diamonds, pearls, uncut gemstones, gold and silver plate, coin, and the centerpiece of the Church of Goa, a 7-foot cross of solid gold encrusted with rubies, diamonds, and emeralds so heavy it required 3 men to lift. It was called the Flaming Cross of Goa. Levasseur and Taylor took the ship without a fight. When they distributed the loot on Réunion, each individual pirate crewman received a share worth around 50,000 pounds, an amount that would have made any of them a wealthy man for life. Nobody knows what happened to Levasseur's captain's share. The Nossa Senhora do Cabo raid is often cited as the single most valuable pirate capture per crewman in history. In 1724, the French government offered amnesty to any pirate in the Indian Ocean who surrendered and gave up his plunder. Levasseur sent a negotiator to the governor of Bourbon to try to arrange terms. The French demanded he hand over most of his fortune as the price of amnesty. Levasseur refused. He faded into the Indian Ocean and became a fugitive, moving between the Seychelles, Madagascar, and the smaller islands for nearly a decade. He was finally captured in 1730 at Fort Dauphin in Madagascar. He was transported aboard a French warship called Le Méduse back to Saint Denis on Bourbon and sentenced to hang. And here, on July 7th, 1730 at 5 p.m., Levasseur stood on the gallows and did something that no other pirate on this list did. According to tradition, he pulled a rolled parchment from around his neck or from his pocket, held it up so the crowd could see it, and hurled it into the crowd of spectators with a shouted challenge. "My treasure to he who can understand. Find my treasure, he who can." Then he was hanged. The parchment survived. It contained a cryptogram written in 17 lines of pigpen cipher, the same simple cipher used by the Freemasons, and in slightly different form by American Civil War prisoners. In 1934, a French marine historian and librarian named Charles Borel de la Roncière published a book about the Levasseur cryptogram, in which he claimed to have solved the pigpen substitution. His plain text, however, made almost no sense. It read as a jumbled, phonetically misspelled French text that seemed to describe not a treasure map, but something closer to a folk remedy or a magical incantation, with words in the wrong order and letters transposed as if the underlying clear text had itself been scrambled by a second layer of encryption, which, if Levasseur was as educated as some sources suggest, was probably the point. Since then, generations of amateur code breakers, professional cryptographers, historians, and treasure hunters have tried to work through La Roncière's plain text and reach the location he supposedly encoded. In 1949, a British big game hunter named Reginald Cruise Wilkins moved to the Seychelles, became convinced the treasure was buried on Mehe Island, and spent the rest of his life digging on the beach at Belle Ombre. He found pirate-era artifacts, coins, and cannonballs, but no main cache. After his death in 1977, his son John continued the search. As of the most recent reports, John Cruise Wilkins was still digging. Estimates of the potential value of Levasseur's fortune range from £100 million to over $1 billion. The Flaming Cross of Goa alone, if it survives intact, would be one of the most valuable religious artifacts in existence. The cryptogram itself has been photographed, transcribed, published, and made available online. Anyone with a laptop can look at it. Anyone with time and patience can try to solve it. In almost 300 years, nobody has produced a solution that has led to the recovery of a single confirmed piece of the treasure. That is why Levasseur is number one. Every other pirate on this list took the location of his treasure to the grave by accident, by pride, or by silence. Levasseur wrote it down, sealed it in a code, and threw it into the crowd. He wanted somebody to find it. He is still waiting. 10 hoards, 10 lost fortunes. Some of them almost certainly folklore dressed up in a corsair's coat like Störtebeker's golden masts and possibly Blackbeard's mythical buried chests. Some of them absolutely real, like the Gardiner's Island cache that helped hang Captain Kidd and the 1715 fleet coins that are still washing up on Florida beaches after every hurricane. Most of them fall in the ambiguous middle, documented enough to be worth searching, undocumented enough that the search never ends. Add the estimates up, from the low end of Störtebeker's phantom masts to the high end of Levasseur's Flaming Cross of Goa, and you get somewhere between $2 billion and $5 billion US in modern value, buried, sunken, or hidden across a stretch of coastline that runs from Hamburg to Nova Scotia to the Seychelles. Every year, a few coins get found. Every year, most of the treasure hunters go home empty-handed. And every so often, a diver on the Treasure Coast of Florida stuffs so many gold pieces of 8 into his glove that they spill onto the deck when he climbs back aboard. Whichever of these 10 is real, whichever is folklore, the numbers say the same thing. Somewhere out there, most of it, provably, is still down there. Which one on this list do you think will be found next? The Levasseur cipher? The Cocos Island caves? The Lafitte swamp? Or the sand off Vero Beach? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. And if you want more pirate history, more forgotten wrecks, and more of the great treasure hunts that never quite ended, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories where these came from, every one of them ending exactly the same way, with a hole in the ground and a very old question. Where did it go?